There's a theme that I've been noticing for the last several months, and it has to do with the relationship between love and personal power. More specifically, it's this question of whether a woman can devote herself fully to the life she is here to build and still experience a partnership that feels safe, supportive, and deeply loving. And it's interesting because I think many of us would immediately say yes. Of course we can have both. But when we look more closely at the choices we have made, the people we have allowed into our lives, and the fears that appear whenever love begins to feel possible, there can still be this hidden belief that eventually we will have to choose the mission or the relationship, expansion or stability, the empire or the love. And I think that is why the Emperor has appeared reversed at the beginning of this message. Not as a prediction about another person, but as a symbol of the way power can become distorted when we have had to carry too much alone. The Emperor is usually connected with structure, leadership, responsibility, and the ability to create something lasting. But reversed, that energy can become over-control. It can become hyper-independence. It can become the feeling that if you stop managing everything for even a moment, the entire life you have worked so hard to create might fall apart. And I have been reflecting on how easy it is to confuse that kind of control with strength. For a long time, being powerful may have meant being the one who could handle everything, the one who did not need reassurance, the one who could recover alone, make the plan alone, regulate the emotions of everyone around her, and still continue working toward the vision. But there is another layer to this. Sometimes we become so committed to protecting our purpose that love begins to feel like a threat to it, and that does not mean we are closed-hearted. It may simply mean that our previous experiences taught us that partnership comes with a cost, that being loved means becoming more available to someone else and less available to ourselves. That emotional security requires us to soften our ambition, rearrange our priorities, or make our dreams easier for another person to tolerate. But what if that was never love asking you to compromise? What if it was simply the wrong structure of partnership? Because the conscious partner is not here to remove you from your mission. Their presence is meant to create more space for both of you to become who you truly are. And before we can receive that kind of relationship, we have to understand why receiving support may still feel more dangerous than doing everything alone. Because when support has been unreliable in the past, receiving it does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like exposure. It can feel like placing something precious into another person's hands without knowing whether they will protect it, neglect it, or eventually use it as leverage. And I think this is where the King of Swords reversed becomes important, not as a description of who is coming toward you, but as a reflection of what the mind learns to do when trust has repeatedly been disappointed. The King of Swords is connected with discernment, clarity, communication, and mature judgment, but reversed, that discernment can become suspicion, clarity can become constant analysis. The desire to make a wise decision can become the need to predict every possible outcome before allowing anyone close enough to affect you. So even when support is offered, part of you may immediately begin evaluating it. What will this person expect in return? How long will their consistency last? Will accepting their help give them access to decisions that belong to me? Will they still respect my strength once they see that I also have needs? And these questions did not appear without reason. They may have protected you from becoming dependent on people who made promises they could not sustain. They may have helped you recognize manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional immaturity before it had the chance to disrupt the life you were building. But protection can continue long after the original danger has passed. You can genuinely desire partnership while still refusing the very experiences that would allow partnership to form. You may minimize what you need. You may say that everything is fine before another person has the opportunity to show up for you. You may silently test their awareness, hoping they will understand what you have never actually allowed yourself to express. Or you may continue choosing people who need your guidance because their dependence confirms the role you already know how to perform. The leader, the stabilizer, the one who never has to risk being held. And this is how distorted Emperor energy can remain in place. Leadership becomes vigilance, responsibility becomes an inability to rest. Independence becomes the only environment in which the nervous system feels completely prepared. But what if your independence was never the problem? What if it was an intelligent response that simply became too permanent? Because there is a difference between wanting a powerful partner and being able to recognize one. A grounded person may not create the urgency you have learned to associate with attraction. They may not activate the familiar cycle of uncertainty, pursuit, relief, and disappointment. And when emotional intensity has been mistaken for strength, genuine stability can be surprisingly difficult to trust. And this is where justice reversed becomes important. Not as a warning that something is wrong, but as a symbol of how our inner measurements can become distorted when we have spent too long equating effort with love. Justice is connected with balance, truth, discernment, and the ability to see a situation clearly. But reversed, it can reflect the ways we misread what is in front of us, because we are still judging it through the standards of the past. So a person who is steady may seem emotionally distant. A person who respects your boundaries may seem less interested. A person who does not rush to possess you may seem uncertain. And someone who does not create chaos may leave you wondering whether there is enough chemistry. But sometimes what feels like chemistry is simply the body recognizing a familiar pattern, the unpredictability. The need to prove yourself. The temporary closeness followed by withdrawal. The feeling that if you can just become more understanding, more patient, more desirable, or less demanding, the connection will finally become secure. That kind of relationship can feel powerful because it requires so much energy. But requiring your energy is not the same as honoring your power. A conscious partner may not need to announce his strength. He may not arrive with grand promises about what he will build for you, or dramatic declarations about how deeply he understands you. His strength may be quieter than that. It may appear in the way his words and actions remain connected over time, in the way he takes responsibility for his own emotions rather than asking you to regulate them for him, in the way he can witness your ambition without turning it into a competition or interpreting your purpose as a rejection of him. He does not need your mission to become smaller so that he can feel significant. And he does not support you because he wants control over what you create. He supports you because he recognizes that your devotion to your work is part of who you are. That does not mean he rescues you. It means he does not create additional instability that you must constantly recover from. And I think this is part of having both the empire and the love. The relationship does not become another responsibility you carry. It becomes a place where responsibility is shared. But secure support can feel unfamiliar before it feels safe. Because when you are accustomed to earning closeness, peace may initially feel empty. When you are accustomed to being pursued and then abandoned, consistency may feel almost too simple to trust. So perhaps the clearest sign of a conscious partner is not the intensity he creates. Perhaps it is what your body is no longer required to do in order to remain connected to him. And I think that is where the Three of Cups reversed becomes significant. Not as a sign of isolation, but as a reflection of how difficult it can be to relax into connection when part of you is still monitoring the emotional environment. The Three of Cups is often connected with ease, openness, shared joy, and the feeling that there is enough space for everyone to be fully present. But reversed, that openness can become guarded. Connection can become performance. Even moments that should feel light can carry the quiet responsibility of making sure everything remains stable. So, you may notice that your body is rarely resting inside the relationship. You are listening for changes in tone, watching for distance, measuring how much of your truth the other person can tolerate before the atmosphere begins to shift. You may rehearse a conversation several times before having it, trying to find the version of your needs that will be least likely to create conflict. You may explain a boundary long after it has already been stated clearly. You may soften the way you speak about your work, because you do not want your ambition to be interpreted as rejection, selfishness, or emotional unavailability, and without realizing it, you are still managing the room, even when there are only two people in it. But in a conscious partnership, the body gradually begins to release that responsibility. You do not have to predict every mood before it arrives. You do not have to remain prepared for affection to disappear because you were honest. You do not have to choose between being fully expressed and staying connected. And this does not mean there will never be discomfort. It means discomfort no longer carries the constant threat of abandonment. Safety is not the absence of depth, and peace is not the absence of desire. Sometimes peace is simply what becomes possible when your energy is no longer being used to protect the relationship from the truth. That energy returns to you. It returns to your creativity, your intuition, your sensuality, your ability to make decisions without first calculating how another person might respond to your expansion. And I think many women have been taught that the next level of power will require more discipline, more effort, and more control. But what if it requires less internal defense? What if rest is not something that interrupts your progress, but something that allows your power to become more precise? Because when your body is no longer carrying the relationship by itself, rest becomes more than recovery. It becomes expansion. And what might become possible if love did not simply coexist with your mission, but increased your capacity to fulfill it? And I think the Two of Wands reversed helps us understand how that increase in capacity actually happens. The Two of Wands is usually connected with vision, direction, and the ability to look beyond the life that already exists toward the life that could be built. But reversed, that vision can become restricted, not because the dream is too large, but because so much energy is being used to protect it. When you have had to build alone, expansion can begin to feel like something that must be guarded from interruption. Every new responsibility has to be measured. Every relationship has to be evaluated according to how much time, focus, or emotional energy it might take away from the larger plan, and that makes sense when partnership has previously consumed more than it contributed. But conscious partnership is not simply two independent people agreeing not to interfere with one another. It is a living structure, a structure in which both people understand that love is not only expressed through affection, but through protecting the conditions that allow each person to become more fully themselves. Sometimes that support looks very ordinary. It looks like honest reflection when one person can no longer see a situation clearly. It looks like reliability that does not need to be requested repeatedly. It looks like emotional steadiness during a season when the outcome is uncertain. It looks like respecting the hours when deep focus is required, offering encouragement without creating pressure, and carrying a shared responsibility without needing to be praised for carrying it. And this does not mean that he becomes an employee of your vision. He is not here to manage your life for you. He is not a saviour, a financial solution, or a background character whose purpose is to make your story easier. He has a direction of his own, an inner authority of his own, a life that also requires devotion, and perhaps that is exactly why the partnership can become expansive. Neither person has to become smaller for the other to remain powerful. Misaligned partnership consumes clarity because so much attention is spent recovering from confusion. Aligned partnership can multiply clarity because truth does not have to fight for space. The right relationship may still challenge you, but it will challenge you toward greater honesty, greater responsibility, and greater alignment with the person you are becoming, not toward more self-abandonment. And I think this is where the promise of having both the empire and the love becomes real. Love does not merely tolerate the mission, it helps create the stability from which the mission can grow. But receiving that kind of love requires more than meeting the right person. It may require releasing the identity of the woman who has been rewarded for never needing anyone. And I think the Three of Wands reversed speaks directly to that identity. The Three of Wands is usually connected with expansion, foresight, and the willingness to move beyond what is already known. But reversed, expansion can become hesitation, not because there is no future available, but because the identity that brought you this far may not know how to enter it. For years, competence may have been more than something you practiced. It may have become the way you understood yourself, the person who finds the solution, the person others call when something falls apart, the person who can carry responsibility without showing how heavy it has become. And there may have been real rewards for becoming that person: admiration, respect, a sense of control, the security of knowing that if no one else followed through, you still would. That identity protected you from disappointment, because it reduced the number of things you had to entrust to another person. But it may also have made being indispensable feel safer than being known, because when people need your strength, they can remain close to your capacity without ever coming close to your vulnerability. They can admire what you produce, depend on what you provide, celebrate how much you can hold, and still never encounter the part of you that is uncertain, tired, tender, or in need of care. So accepting support may feel like more than receiving help. It may feel like losing access to the version of yourself who survived. There can be a fear that you will become less sharp, less free, less respected, or that without the constant demand to remain strong, you will no longer recognize who you are. But surrender is not submission, receptivity is not passivity, and interdependence is not helplessness. Allowing someone to stand beside you does not erase the strength that allowed you to stand alone. It simply means that strength no longer has to be performed every moment in order to remain real, and I think there is grief in that transition. Because even a limiting identity can be difficult to release when it once kept you safe. You do not have to reject the woman who handled everything. You can honor her. You can recognize what she built, what she protected, and how much she endured, but she may not be the only version of you capable of leading the life that comes next. Perhaps the deepest compromise was never choosing love over the mission. Perhaps it was choosing a version of power that left no room for anyone to truly stand beside you. And I think the High Priestess reveals why that space may have remained unavailable. The High Priestess is connected with inner knowing, discernment, and the ability to recognize what is true before there is enough evidence to explain it. But that knowing can become difficult to trust when the heart is invested in someone's potential. You may sense that a person is not ready to meet you where you are, and still you can see who they might become. You can see the intelligence beneath the confusion, the purpose beneath the avoidance, the capacity beneath the inconsistency, and because you are able to recognize what is possible in another person, you may begin relating to that possibility as though it already exists. You become the planner, the encourager, the one who brings language to emotions they have not learned to name, the one who holds the vision during every season when they stop believing in it themselves. And these relationships can feel meaningful because they make your presence important. Your strength has a function there. Your insight is constantly required. Your ability to stabilize, motivate, and understand becomes part of what holds the connection together. But being valuable to someone is not always the same as being supported by them. And seeing a person's potential is not the same as witnessing their demonstrated capacity. A conscious partner does not need to be managed into readiness. He may still be imperfect. He may still have fears, unfinished work, and areas where he is growing. But he is already in relationship with his own responsibility. He does not wait for your love to become the structure of his life. He has begun building that structure for himself. And there is another layer to this. Choosing someone who cannot fully meet you can preserve a certain kind of control, because when you are the more capable person, you already understand your role. You know what to provide. You know what to anticipate. You know how to remain necessary, but mutuality is less predictable. To be met by someone who can see through the performance of strength, respond to what you actually express, and remain present without needing to be carried, may feel more exposing than rescuing someone ever did. Because then, you are no longer protected by usefulness. You have to allow yourself to be known. So the question becomes more precise. Do you want to remain necessary, or are you ready to be genuinely met? Perhaps conscious love does not arrive because you finally convince someone to rise to your level. Perhaps it arrives when you refuse to descend into the role that once made love feel familiar. And I think the Two of Pentacles speaks to the decision that follows. This card is often connected with balance, adaptation, and the ability to hold multiple responsibilities without losing connection to what matters. But there is a difference between balance and constant negotiation. There is a difference between making space for another person and repeatedly moving yourself out of the way. For a long time, compromise may have meant adjusting your needs until the relationship could continue, explaining more, waiting longer, accepting uncertainty because you could understand where it came from, carrying the emotional weight because you knew you were capable of carrying it, and none of that necessarily came from weakness. It may have come from empathy, from patience, from the sincere desire to love another person without demanding that they become perfect. But there is a point where understanding someone else begins to require abandoning what you already understand about yourself. And that is where the compromise becomes too expensive. Because no more compromise does not mean no more vulnerability. It does not mean expecting a relationship without mistakes, discomfort, or growth. It means no longer exchanging your self-trust for temporary closeness, your purpose for approval, your peace for chemistry, your integrity for the hope that someone may eventually become able to meet you. It means becoming unavailable for chronic confusion, for emotional labor that is never returned, for connection that quietly competes with your expansion, for relationships in which you must continue proving that you are worthy of the care you have already been giving, and this decision is not an ultimatum directed at another person, it is an agreement you make with yourself. Standards are not punishments, boundaries are not strategies for controlling someone else, they simply clarify the conditions under which love can remain honest. And once that internal agreement becomes real, something begins to change. You notice different qualities, you stop being impressed by intensity without consistency. You become less willing to entertain potential that is unsupported by action. You trust what is demonstrated, not only what is promised, and perhaps most importantly, you stop interpreting your own discomfort as evidence that you are asking for too much. A conscious partner can recognize that shift. Not because he is searching for a woman who never needs anything, but because he has also stopped abandoning himself in order to remain connected. He does not need rescue. You do not need control. Neither of you is asking the other person to provide an identity, a purpose, or a missing sense of worth. So when two people are no longer coming together to be saved, managed, or completed, what are they actually coming together to create? And I think the Two of Swords reversed reveals what they are coming together to create. The Two of Swords is often connected with choice, inner conflict, and the attempt to maintain peace by holding opposing truths at a distance. But reversed, the stalemate begins to break. What has been avoided can no longer remain separate. Love and purpose, strength and receptivity, devotion to another person, and devotion to the life you are here to build. The relationship is no longer organized around choosing one truth and suppressing the other. It becomes a place where both can exist, not through merging identities, not through one person making their dream more important than the other's, but through the creation of a shared foundation strong enough to hold two distinct lives. A conscious partnership allows both people to take meaningful risks because neither person has to face uncertainty without emotional support. It allows truth to be spoken before resentment has the chance to become structure. It allows failure to remain an experience rather than becoming an identity, and it allows each person to return to their purpose without needing to withdraw from love in order to find themselves again. This is where the Emperor begins to return in a healthier form. Authority is no longer the need to control every outcome. It becomes the ability to build structures that protect what matters. Commitment, honesty, time, shared responsibility, the freedom for both people to continue becoming, and that structure needs something else beside it. Receptivity, intuition, the emotional wisdom to recognize when strength requires action and when it requires listening. Neither quality is complete by itself, because structure without tenderness becomes rigid, and openness without structure can become unstable. Together, they create a relationship that is not only romantic, but purposeful. And the empire is not simply wealth, status, visibility, or achievement. It is the life you are creating, the contribution you are here to make, the legacy formed through the choices you repeat when no one is watching, the inner kingdom that determines what you will protect, what you will no longer tolerate, and what you are willing to devote yourself to fully. The right partner does not stand between you and that life. He does not stand behind you as an accessory to it. He stands beside you, with a mission of his own, with an inner world he has also taken responsibility for, and together you are not completing one another. You are creating the conditions in which both lives can become more complete. So perhaps the remaining question is no longer whether this kind of love exists. Perhaps it is whether you are willing to let love arrive in a form that feels different from everything you have known. And I think the Fool reversed speaks to why allowing that difference may require so much trust. The Fool is often connected with beginnings, openness, and the willingness to step into something new without knowing every detail of how it will unfold. But reversed, that openness can become hesitation, not because the path is wrong, but because uncertainty has previously carried too much risk. When you have learned to depend on yourself, the unfamiliar can feel less like possibility and more like the loss of protection. You may believe that before you receive love, you need to become even clearer, even stronger, even more accomplished, or even more certain that nothing can destabilize you. But perhaps the preparation is not becoming more impressive. Perhaps it is becoming more available for reciprocity, available to notice consistency without searching for the hidden cost, available to express a need without apologizing for having one, available to let another person contribute without assuming that their contribution gives them authority over your life. Because support does not erase sovereignty, and receiving does not undo everything your independence taught you. Your hyper-independence was not a failure, it was protection. The intensity you once recognized as strength was not evidence that you lacked discernment. It may simply have been the form of connection your system understood at the time. But your understanding can change, power can return to its healthier expression, structure without rigidity, leadership without isolation, standards without walls, devotion without self-abandonment. This is the Emperor no longer reversed by fear, not controlling every outcome, but knowing what deserves to be protected. Not carrying everything alone, but choosing carefully what can be shared. Not building walls around the empire, but creating a foundation strong enough for love to enter without threatening what has already been built. And the conscious partner does not arrive to take over your path. He does not replace your judgment, redirect your purpose, or ask to become the center of a life that was already meaningful before him. He respects the path, he strengthens the space around it, and he walks beside you while remaining devoted to a path of his own. So you do not have to sacrifice the empire for love, and you do not have to reject love in order to protect the empire. The choice was never meant to remain between expansion and stability, between power and tenderness, between being fully yourself and being deeply loved. The relationship worthy of your life will not require you to become less devoted to what you are here to build. It will make room for that devotion. And love worthy of you will never ask you to leave yourself behind.